To give you some idea about that, I mentioned jobs, of critical importance, but just to put it in perspective in one little area, and that is education. With the stimulus dollars, we were not only able to create employment in these economically depressed areas, but we built new or did major renovation on 28 schools for Indian children. Over 70 had significant renovations done because of the money that we had that was one-time money. We still have a huge backlog. If you were to bring Indian schools up to just what the rest of America gets, we would need about $1.5 billion to be able to do that. And the federal government only educates about 10% of all Native American students. In other words, what I'm talking about is the Bureau of Indian Education system. We operate 183 schools, and those are the schools that we were repairing and rebuilding. Land is sacred to Native people. Native people have gone through a history of processes that have taken land from them. And I remember coming in as a new assistant secretary, I said, if there's one thing that I can do, I want to try to restore lands to Native communities. To give you some idea about that, just between 1887 and 1934, through one congressional enactment called the General Allotment Act, Native people lost 90 million acres of land. 90 million acres. Most of that acreage was from Native tribes that had treaties with the United States. And I know you've not read these treaties. There will be some of you in the room that have, but literally in some of those treaties, the United States would promise permanent homelands through treaties to say that this land will forever be yours. And the language literally would say, as long as the grass grows and the river flows, this will be your homeland. That did not turn out to be the case. So I just had this part of me said, I want to try to restore some of that land. Prior to coming in the 2 years before me, there is a process in place for taking land into trust. Now that doesn't mean the federal government buys the land. It just means that the tribes will petition the United States to take this land into trust, and that will mean it will be protected in perpetuity for future generations, because title is held in the name of the United States for the benefit of the tribe. Well, 15,000 acres in 2 years. Took me a little while working with dedicated people back in Washington, D.C. to get the system up and running, because it had pretty much ground to a halt. But within the next 2 years, we took into trust 157,000 acres. In other words, tenfold increase in the amount of land that was taken into trust. I don't know what the figures are up to date, but I think that was at least a symbolic effort to try to turn things around and allow Native people to have parts of their homeland restored for schools, for medical facilities, for law and order purposes, for economic development, to create jobs. That land becomes vitally important. And of course, there was the Cobell case. It's got a lot of coverage in the news. Unless you follow Indian affairs, maybe you missed it. But the federal government has had some pretty dark chapters in its history of managing the lands and resources of Native people. They have been identified as the trustee for Indian tribes. And so they, in terms of the law, they hold legal title to the land, but they are supposed to be fiduciaries acting according to the highest standards in managing those assets. Well, what happened is the federal government did a very poor job. They could not account for how they had managed as a trustee. And so several years ago, tribes are actually individual Indians. The lead plaintiff was Eloise Cobell, brought suit against the United States. So for 14 years, they tried to settle up on that case. Republican and Democratic administrations in the past had tried to settle. President Obama, in his campaign, said, "We will settle Cobell." And of course, people thought, oh yeah, that's been tried before. But we were able to get it settled. And the settlement would bring, or will bring, $3.4 billion toward individual Indians to settle those claims. Part of that will include college scholarships, about $60 million worth. So that would just be laying, finally concluding a just claim of law. The tribes had similar claims, and those have been brought. And thus far, there have been an additional $1 billion approximately, affecting about 41 tribes that have been settled. So some of these historic mismanagement claims have been able to make it through, and that is not a small task to accomplish. I think in light of the time that I've got, I'm not going to be able to highlight what we did for public safety. I believe that the President of the United States probably came looking to Brigham Young University to pick Larry Echohawk because, I don't know this for a fact, but I served as a prosecuting attorney, as a state attorney general in Idaho. The attorney general is identified as the chief law enforcement officer for the state. I teach criminal law, and I thought it's because we needed something done in public safety, and we were able to accomplish amazing things in that area, which included the passage of legislation, over 200 pages of legislation, an enactment called the Tribal Law and Order Act, meant to make Native communities safer. And I think the last thing I'll spotlight would be water rights, which are of critical importance in the arid West for economic development. In my first major speech as Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, in the spirit of the moment, I was at the podium and I said, this administration will fight for and be aggressive in trying to accomplish water rights settlements. And settlements are important between states and tribes to be able to resolve these historic claims so that we quantify, we know, who's entitled to what, and then we can have economic development. I walked off the stage that day, and a senior official of the Department of Interior walked up to me and said, Mr. Secretary, you should not have said that. They are expensive, and we don't think we'll be able to get them across the line. Well, thank you very much. We got 7 of them across the line.